So, a very good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. This short presentation is going to take us through the chapter India and the Global Hegemonic Order, which is co-authored by Ravi Dutt Bajpai, my colleague from Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia, and Swati Parashar, that is me at the School of Global Studies, University of Gothenburg in Sweden. So, what are we saying in this chapter? Essentially, we engage with the concept of hegemony, the new hegemonies, the older hegemonies, how it is being conceptualized, and essentially the place of India in this hegemonic order. And we do a little bit of a genealogy here where we try to understand independent India's location within hegemonic structures. And then, of course, the period of decline. And now that we are talking about the Asian century, how is it that, in the rise of the other powers, the alternative powers, how is India located within that? So we do a little bit of a genealogy in this chapter. But first, what is hegemony in practice? How do we understand hegemony? The term is, of course, Gramscian. We are all familiar with it. And how it is a combination of material, normative, and institutional power to shape the exchanges among other actors. And I think the key concept of hegemony that we try to point out is also the idea that it is constructed, it is based on consent, it is based on a normative understanding of power. So those are two or three important things to remember. Obviously, when we look at the international system, hegemony is constantly in flux. It is changing. It does not belong to a specific state. In fact, we talk about how different states go through a period of rise in hegemony, and then, of course, there's always the period of decline, and then they come back. So it's constantly in flux. It is not a specific ideology. It cannot be pinpointed to specific sets of institutions. Of course, an existing hegemon can always be challenged. There are always alternative configurations that emerge, and that is very easy to understand in the current setup, because we are all talking about, especially in the context of the pandemic, we are talking about the decline of the liberal international order. We are talking about the decline of Anglo-American hegemony. We are talking about the decline of American power. We are talking about the decline of European Union. So, and we are talking, of course, about the rise of other states, and primarily about China. But there is obviously a lot of discussion about India, Brazil, South Africa. We are talking about BRICS in that context. So it's a really shifting paradigm within which we are examining hegemony today. And of course, 21st century, if you look at 21st century, which actually is the century of challenging the normative global order, we are talking about counter hegemons in the 21st century who look like they might even be able to replace hegemonic powers in the system. And today we are talking about China and India in that context. But let's keep the focus on India and talk a little bit about India, the counter hegemon. In counter hegemonic descriptive that India is, right? So a little bit of genealogy here, the importance of the Indian independence movement, and especially the Gandhian nonviolence that places India in a particular context within anti-colonial struggles. And therein starts the story of India in its efforts to establish self-rule and to become independent, the idea that it was going to adopt some practices of the modern nation state, right? And 1947, of course, India becomes independent and joins the nation state system. Under Prime Minister Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, foreign policy was defined by non-alignment, non-aggression, and disarmament. And this was a period when India was trying to create its own space within the polarized global order. It was trying to maintain that very delicate balance between the two blocks. Of course, it was quite closely aligned to the USSR at various times, but there was always that tension and to dissociate itself from and a declared policy of alignment, that India was trying to create its own space within the nations that had fought against colonial rule and that were trying to create solidarity among post-colonial nations. Non-alignment in that sense was very dear to Prime Minister Nehru, and it was a counter-hegemonic move against the bipolar hegemony. In some sense, so while India became a part of this counter-hegemonic move in the international system, within its own space, within its own domestic space, it also became a hegemonic power. And with that, what we mean is that there were certain kinds of continuities that we noticed between, say, colonial rule and when the post-colonial elites took power. And that was the peculiarity. So on the one hand, India was positioning itself as a counter-hegemonic power in the international system. Within India, there was also this construction of hegemony, especially with issues of citizenship, with issues of rights, who were included, who was outside. So there were all these issues that were being defined at the point of independence, and particularly during what is now defined as the Nehruvian era. During the Nehruvian era, which is absolutely critical for constructing India as a post-colonial counter-hegemonic nation state, India was seen as, in some sense, as offering a counter-hegemonic narrative. And therefore, even though one could argue that non-alignment is a failed project, one must remember that this project itself was seen with a lot of optimism. Nehru's vision was obviously one of preventing the Cold War spread in Asia. He was committed to that. His ambition was also to align with China to create this counter-hegemonic front. Both these countries had shared a very long history of their own self-rule undermined by colonialism. They had all seen aggressive wars. And so the idea was that both of these countries could actually be the power in Asia that could actually challenge the bipolar world order. And of course, non-alignment in some sense also, on the one hand, being counter-hegemonic in its narrative, also could be seen as a hegemonic enterprise. It kind of became something of an alignment of nation states that were forcing neutrality on developing Afro-Asian colonized nations. So in some sense, one could argue that within hegemonic structures, counter-hegemony is always part of it. And then the other way around, that you can create counter-hegemonic structures, but there is no stopping hegemonic structures to emerge within that. Nehru's Sinocentrism, or his kind of very emphasis on a very good relationship with China and focusing on China as a non-aligned partner, was quite significant. And that was reflected in many of his policies, which today is criticized because a lot of analysts would argue that he failed to see that China was thinking of itself as a realist power and not so much as an idealist as Nehru had imagined. But his support to China, on the issue of Tibet, in the Korean War, on the issue of Taiwan, and particularly what unfolded with the Indochina War of 1962, are today seen as flawed policies during his era. But at that point of time, he was watching this space very carefully and thinking long-term in terms of creating these alliances with China, and supporting China in the international forum, so that these two powers, India and China, could be closely aligned. In some sense, one could argue that Nehruvian era foreign policy was very much focused on socializing China. And of course, the Panchsheel that came up, which became part of the non-aligned movement, and the Bandung Summit of 1955 laid the foundation of socializing China into the international system, and Nehru took that role very seriously. Unfortunately for Prime Minister Nehru, despite his best efforts of being inclusive towards China, and despite his kind of long-term vision that India and China needed to work together, a bitter war, armed exchange unfolded in 1962, the Sino-India War, and that changed a lot of dynamics. That war, a lot of analysts would argue, was very unfortunate. It was forced. It was miscalculation on both sides. One would need a separate state to talk about it. However, it kind of demolished the myth that both these powers could work together and that they had a lot in common. It was clearly established that to protect national interests, an armed exchange between them, which had not happened before and which has subsequently also not happened to that scale, was also a possibility. This was a single most important factor in how Nehru's own ideas about the world changed, and it is argued that played a big role in how devastated he was, and eventually, the fact that he died a couple of years later. So post 1962, India, which was trying to, before that, during the Nehruvian period, trying to create this alliance between China and India, and was trying to be the counter-hegemonic force as two post-colonial nations, or as leading the non-aligned movement. A little bit changes with post 1962 or post the war with China, where India presents itself as a regional hegemon. And there were a number of indicators of why India's, you could argue, India's standing in the South Asian region, India's broader understanding of Asia underwent a lot of changes. And in some sense, India was counting the losses, losing the international profile, and of course, the Nehruvian ideology, that kind of a very idealistic, liberal, internationalist approach to international relations had changed. 1965 saw another war with Pakistan, and then, of course, the 1971 war that comes later. In fact, India was struggling both at with the border with China and with Pakistan. So it was a two-front war that emerged in the 60s. And late 60s also saw the rise of Indira Gandhi, Nehru's daughter, and very important and powerful prime minister of the country. And she catapulted India into the global powers politics, and began to strategize geopolitics in a very different way. 1971, the liberation war of Bangladesh was absolutely critical, in which India played a critical role with armed assistance, with participating in the war, as a result of which East Pakistan gained independence, and it became the independent state of Bangladesh. That war is called the Liberation War of Bangladesh, and it led to bitter war with Pakistan. 90,000 prisoners of war were taken by India and then are subsequently freed through an agreement with the Pakistani regime. So those are the nitty-gritties of the debate, but it's important to realize that this war, the rise of Indira Gandhi, the war on both fronts, and of course, the 1974 nuclear explosion, all of this kind of catapulted India into a space where it began to be seen as a player which wanted a bigger role in the region and began to be seen as a regional hegemon. In 1979 came the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and in some sense, by 1989, the war then shifts to the eastern border with Pakistan, and what was launched as the War of 1,000 Cuts. And so India, in some sense, began to be surrounded on the one hand by hostilities with China, hostilities with Pakistan, and of course with the creation of a new state, and subsequently redefining also its relationship in the neighborhood. So there was a lot going on post the 60s, right up to the late 80s, and one could argue that India was in a big hurry to establish itself as the regional hegemon. Come 21st century, again, things have changed, and we argue now that we are watching the rise of multipolar hegemony in the world. In some sense, you could argue that there's a globalization of hegemonic power, and so we're looking at power beyond material, power beyond ideology, beyond alliances. And we're also watching the actual hegemon, the hegemon since the end of the Cold War, the US-led liberal international order. We have watched that it has dwindled in the last few years. One could argue that the Trump era was perhaps the lowest in terms of how American power has ebbed away, and it'll be interesting to see what they have managed to recover in the post-pandemic world. The rise of China is critical. It was seen as a potential challenger. Now it is seen as a credible alternative with big question marks. How China will behave, what kind of a power it will be interesting questions to watch out for. How it'll engage with its neighborhood and with the rest of the world. The rise of the rest, therefore, not just China, but also India, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, the BRICS nations will also be watched out for. These will be very important nations as we think also of a post-pandemic world, and we think of a new global order, and we think of how the countries will interact with each other, and how the multipolar hegemony will be strengthened. So in some sense, it is the era of multipolar hegemony that we are talking about. And in this context, when we are talking about this multipolar world, we're also thinking about the Asian century, right? We began to hear of this often being used, that we're looking at the Asian century. In the Asian century, India will be sharing a multipolar hegemonic world. And this has been marked in various ways. Of course, the 1998 India going fully nuclear, immediate sanctions were imposed. Later on, those sanctions were removed, and it kind of received grudging acceptance. There's also a recalibration, if you like, or resettling of US-India relations from estranged democracies. All through the Cold War, India tried to stay away from it, but was known to be very close to USSR. That has since changed since the 90s, and India has recalibrated to really engaging with the US and thinking of it as an important strategic partner, but at the same time, trying to still keep a distance so that it doesn't get co-opted into American wars and American-led world order without its own standing. China and India have engaged in different stages of balancing each other. They have challenged each other. They have also challenged the order, which is what we talk about in the Asian century. But also that, more importantly, they are not just channeling each other. They are not just using each other creatively in very interesting ways to work with each other, and through that also challenging the global international order through BRICS, through AIIB, through OBOR and Indo-Pacific that we are talking about increasingly. So we see that both of these powers are very suspicious of each other. They are challenging each other, but at the same time, they're also channeling each other in very creative ways, particularly in these international and regional groupings. So what are our final agreements, our arguments? We want to re-emphasize that what we are watching today is the end of a single hegemonic order. No single power is going to hold the world in terms of hegemony. It will not be the only hegemonic power, whether it is the US, and that applies also to China. It will not be the only hegemonic power. In some sense, we are watching at a world where a collaborative hegemony might emerge. There'll be fluidity in configuration of hegemony. There will always be questions about who, what, how, and when. How will these reconfigurations occur? Who will be part of new alliances, and how will big powers balance each other? Those questions will be really critical, which will eventually make the world multilateral and in some sense counter-hegemonic. Multilateral counter-hegemonic world order is already in the making. How far will it be successful in being counter-hegemonic? How far will it become hegemonic in the process? And which powers will play a critical role, and when will be something to watch out for. But in this multilateral world order that we're talking about, India will have a very critical role. So this is all we have to say today. We would urge you to read our chapter, and we would be very happy to take any questions. You can reach us at Ravi at Deakin University, and you can reach me at Gothenburg University. Our emails are available in the public domain, but we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for your time.